I'm on day 105 of the Odin project, and my final JavaScript project, I feel like it's really picking up right now. Hey, it's Cody. If you're new to the channel, welcome to A Couple Codes. This is my vlog to document my journey with the Odin project. My wife and I are doing the Odin project full time together, and we're doing vlogs throughout the week and a weekly update where we both come together to talk about our progress with the Odin project. So if you're new and you're interested in following our journey into web development, then definitely hit subscribe. So I'm working on the final JavaScript project, and as I mentioned, I think it's really coming together now. I'm starting to focus my attention to the core value that the application is going to have for users, and I'm really trying to focus in on making minimum viable features for those pieces of value. Past 2 days, I've been working on making the view lexicon component show the user their lexicon data in a very manageable way. The lexicon data can be complex because it's hierarchical. So if you the lexicon data itself, the attributes that are within a lexicon, and then you have references for each attribute. So a lexicon can have multiple attributes, and each attribute can have multiple references. So I'm playing around with how do I make that manageable for the user, but also allow them to still have access to all their data. To do that, I'm working on a data table that allows the user to see their attributes and then also expand those attributes with an expandable row component to then show the references for the attribute. But let's take a look at the screen to actually see what I'm talking about here. So we see we're in the user dashboard, and we see that there's a table here. So this is the view lexicon component, and specifically the lexicon table component that is rendered after the database comes back with the data. We see that there's a header up here, attribute definition modality, defining what's within each column, and each row is an attribute itself. Each row is also clickable, so you can click on it and then more data will appear. So if we click on this one, we can see that after numbing has been modified on this date and has a references table, just one reference here. But if we take a look at this sweetness attribute, we see that it has a lot more references, so it's a lot more information that we're trying to pack in here. And I'm still working on the design of this, but I'm liking this expandable component for opening up rows and closing rows with additional information. But let's take a look at the code to see what this looks like. So down here, we have this data table component, and this is coming from a library called React Data Table Component that has a lot of handy features for making these kinds of dynamic tables. So we'll see with this component, it takes a columns property and the data property. So these two properties and their values will allow us to define what's being displayed up in this header. So that's going to be our columns, and then also displaying what specifically is going to show up in the rows for each column. Those two things are the mandatory aspects of the component. Everything else is optional, but it does help out with making these more complicated data tables. So this first one is a dense setting, so it's set to true if it's a property. And we'll see if I delete this dense property and then save it, that the table then becomes bigger. So there's more room and more padding in the rows, and it's just more spread out. I like to have the data be more dense and close up together so that we can pack in more information there. The next property is fixed header. So if this was a larger table, this header would stay in place if we were scrolling over rows. So if I set this to like 30, we'll see that it kind of scrolls a little bit here. You notice right there, it's kind of going over that row. If we had like 60 and I could scroll down further, then it would just have the header be maintained over top of the rows. So that makes it more convenient for knowing, oh, if I'm on row 100, what column is this and what column is this? So that's what that's for. I may not use that since I'm going to try to keep these a little bit more tight. Next is the pointer on hover. So if you hover over a row, you see there's a pointer here. So it's indicating that there's some interactivity going here. Highlight on hover is the same thing, except it's just highlighting the rows. Striped is, if you see there's slight different colors between the even and odd rows here. So if I delete that, save, we'll see that now it's all white rows. And if I put it back in there, now we have alternating striped rows. Pagination is relevant for the bottom. So I kind of showed you guys this earlier. So it has these features down here, rows per page, and then creating pages for each chunk of data. So it just allows them to navigate those pages. And then the last three are regards to the expandable rows. So expand row on clicked is this particular feature. If you click on a row, then it's going to expand and show the expandable row. Expandable rows is just a true or false, just to say if we are going to have expandable rows. And then this is the actual component that you're going to pass to it for what you're going to render in the expandable row. I'll come back to the expandable row later on when I show you guys that component. Let's jump back up here to see the columns and data. What are we passing to those those properties. For the columns, it's going to be an array of objects, and each object is essentially going to describe what each column is and the different properties it has. So name to start out with is just going to be the column name that's displayed up here. The selector is that within the data, how do we actually access the values that we want to display for each row? So the data is going to be an array of objects that are going to be rows, and then for each row, to get to the name for this particular, get to the attribute for this particular data, we go to attribute.Definitely within that row. Max width is just setting the maximum width. Wrap is wrapping the column's data. So we see that particularly with the definitions, we see astringent mouthfeel is wrapping, modality is wrapping over here. So each one of these columns is actually wrapping. And then sortable is to allow the columns to be sortable upon clicking. So we can see that it is clickable and that it's changing the sorting based off of which column I'm actually clicking on. So that's the columns. There's a lot more properties that can be set, but these are the ones that I'm using so far. If we go down here to the data, we're actually going to build this data up from the lexicon factory function from the lexicon object. So we're going to do lexicon get attributes to get the array of attribute objects. And for each attribute object, we are going to get the references from that attribute. And then we're going to build this references data for row array. We're going to iterate over each of the references, and we're going to push into that references data for row the reference return reference object. So that's going to be more of property values of a reference object instead of having a bunch of methods with it too. And then lastly, at the end of each attribute, we're going to push the attribute data and the references data to the overall data array. So it's going to be an object that has attr data, which is attribute data. We're returning the attribute object here, and then we're going to return that array that we built for the references data for row, the refs data. We see with this data table, the references or the attribute data is specifically the thing that's within the unexpanded rows. So that's the main part that's being shown here, and that's because of what we set up here with the row attribute data.name, row attribute data.definition, and row attribute data.modality. If we take a look at the expanded row, we'll see that the expanded row is going to be oriented to the additional attribute data, but also then for the references themselves. So let's click on this one. This first bit is, so we have the expanded row, then we're going to have additional attribute data because there's some attribute data that wasn't displayed. We're going to have just a text to show last modified, and then this is going to get the date modified from the attribute data specifically. And we see that over here. And then we're going to have just a little title here for references table, a table container, and then we're going to actually use that data table component again to make this smaller data table for the references specifically. So this is a pretty small reference table. This one's a little bit bigger. It has 2 references, but again, it's pretty much the same thing as what we saw earlier. Columns are going to be a little bit different, or are going to be different, but same thing. I'm trying to customize it so the design is a little bit better here. But yeah, I'm definitely going to have to do some tweaking there to get the UI a bit more clear of what's going on. So I could add some gray background to this overall container, and then also lay out these different containers and tables and values in a bit more of a user-friendly way. But I'm really excited about this. I think that this is the core aspect of the site for after the user actually uploads their data and information. This is going to then take what they had in their own CSV that they were managing on their own just by moving around an Excel document to something that is a bit more user-friendly. That way they can still have the complexity and the utility of their sensory lexicons, but not necessarily have all the burden of making the Excel document user-friendly and accessible. But yeah, that's all I have for today. So tomorrow I'm not going to be doing a live stream. Em and I are going to be going to a local tech meetup, so we'll see how that goes. That'll be our first one doing that, so pretty excited about that. The next thing that you'll see from me is our weekly update on Friday. So Em and I will be getting back together and chatting on Friday, so I will see you guys there.